Respect for human life is a necessary foundation for the family, the culture, and the nation. What life issues are important today, and what does the Church say about them? Stay tuned.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex mundo luces orta.
Welcome to the EWTN Theology Roundtable. We are here to discuss the life issues from conception to natural death, including abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, and war. I'm your host, Colin Donovan, and I'm joined by Father Joseph Mary Wolfe of the Franciscan Missionaries, and by Noah Lett and David Gregson of our Theology Department. The term life issues has a variety of meaning. For some, it is simply the issues related to abortion and euthanasia. For others, it includes capital punishment, and for others, it includes a subject like a living wage and even health care issues and so on. The Church herself has used a variety of expressions in this respect. In his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, Pope John Paul II notes that to be pro-life can't be anything other than to have a gospel of life, a love for man, a gospel of the dignity of the person, and that it's all a single and indivisible gospel. This also, the Second Vatican Council said, and the Pope quotes it in his encyclical, "Whoever is opposed to life itself, such as any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, torments inflicted on body or mind, attempts to coerce the will itself, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where people are treated as mere instruments of gain rather than as free as responsible persons. All these things and others like them are infamies indeed." So the Church does conceive that life and the way in which we live and the way we treat the living is indeed a pro-life question. But the reality is also that in treating all of these issues and in trying to find solutions to them, it's necessary to make distinctions, and the Church does this as well, between those things which are primary and those things that are secondary. The primary things is life itself. Do we exist? Am I prevented from being existing? If I'm coming into existence, am I now killed? And so we need to deal with the essential element, life itself, and then secondarily, what flows from it, the various problems of life. Father Joseph, I think this certainly is among Catholics. There are those who, when they talk about this issue, they say, well, it's not just abortion and euthanasia and so on. It is capital punishment and just war and a living wage and all of that. Mm-hmm. I think pastorally the Church, however, is very clear about this distinction as well.
Yes, that certainly these are all very important issues and things that we want to resolve, but there is a certain primacy. You know, Doug Keck and I recently covered the Canada March for Life, and there was a music group there of young people, and the title of that group is Survived 88. And what that talks to is that in 1988, the Canada Supreme Court legalized abortion without any restrictions whatsoever to the 9th month of pregnancy. Well, these young people are saying we survived. So there is a certain primacy in the fact that we have life. These others are secondary, but they're also important.
And even morally, we're always having to make judgments and distinctions regarding what is intrinsically evil versus what is not intrinsically evil. Obviously, to take a life is intrinsically evil, but politically there can be discussions about what constitutes a living wage, or what constitutes the best way to deliver health care, or what constitutes the best way to protect the rights of union members, as well as the rights of other people who invest in employment and are employers and so on. I think, Noah, this idea of of a distinction has an important place in the discussion.
Oh, it certainly does. Reasonable people might disagree about what a living wage is, but no reasonable person should disagree with the fact that life is fundamental. You know, if I can't have a life, if I can't be born, if I am killed at my inception, after my inception, how am I going to ever have a wage? You know, it's pretty clear that certain things are more important than others because about them reasonable people should not disagree. The innocent should be kept from being murdered.
Dave, among our subjects here tonight, we have 4 primarily: abortion and things that are like it, the abortifacient drugs, the whole context of the HHS mandate discussion, Plan B and Ella, those things which cause abortions, contraceptions which can cause abortion, and euthanasia, though all of that is the taking of life. Capital punishment and just war can be the taking of life, but there's a basic difference there between the first 2, abortion and euthanasia, and capital punishment and just war.
Yeah, it's the difference between taking innocent life and life that may not be so innocent. There is no justification for the taking of innocent life. There may be justification for going to war or self-defense or maintaining order in society. The thou shalt not kill has reference to innocent life, not life to which God may have given governments the right to be taken away.
And this is going to be there for a good portion of our program this evening, because what we're looking at now is then what is the foundational principles that undergird what the church teaches in this area, both regarding not taking life and those cases where there can be justified exceptions because of established guilt of the individual, or say somebody invading somebody's home where they have no right to be and threatening the family, a case of self-defense. Well, let's look a little bit of that. The church herself, in speaking of this, usually speaks both in terms of the natural law, those things with reason unassisted by divine revelation can determine, and those things which divine revelation, sacred scripture, and sacred tradition, as taught through the generations by the magisterium of the church, what that actually tells us is the will of God in these matters. The natural law is a pretty straightforward thing. I have life, I don't want anyone to take it, and therefore I accord that respect to other people as well. And I think, Father, that's the starting point even for sacred scripture, because obviously in the book of Genesis we have the fact that God is the creator of life. Mm-hmm. So we can determine by reason that, well, I wouldn't want Father Joseph to kill me, therefore I ought not to kill Father Joseph. But Revelation makes that secure as to why beyond that we should not do it.
Yes, and I think this is one of the great contributions that Christianity has brought to the history of the world, is that there's this recognition of the dignity of the human person, that we are made in the imago Dei, in the image of God. And so the book of Genesis says that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And so this is where you see spring out of Christianity this respect for the dignity of every person, even the poor, that let's educate them. You know, the church was involved in that to help raise their level of a standard of living. Those who are sick and weak, let's assist them and help them to be healthy. The Pope pointed out in his interview with Peter Seewald that the church does more for AIDS victims than any other organization. And yet, you know, he was critiqued for his comments about condoms is not the solution to the AIDS crisis.
And that certainly is the motive behind the church's social work and its care of the living. That's sort of the second half of the broader general life issues matter. Not to digress too much, but of course this is precisely the element that in the context of the Affordable Care Act and the HHS mandate, that the church is saying that it is preventing the church from doing that. we're free to believe that man has dignity and to made in the image of God, but the government is going to tell us then how we are to serve man in the context and whether we're Catholic enough to serve man. No, there's another aspect of this which is sort of fascinating because Pope Benedict even has touched on this in his writings, his personal writings about Jesus of Nazareth, and that is, it flows from divine revelation that death entered the world with sin, with the sin of Adam. What the Church and her fathers and doctors have always taught, that had Adam and Eve not died, there would have been a period of probation for them, but at some point God simply would have taken them to heaven, perhaps like he did the Blessed Mother in assuming him. It's really a fascinating thought that death is not a good.
Yes. Wisdom, chapter 1, verse 13. God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. Wisdom 2, 23 and 24. God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world. Christianity again teaches the world that though the death of the innocent is certainly wrong, the death of the guilty is also something that you want to try to avoid, because God did not make man for death. And who doesn't, when they see the death of a loved one or facing death themselves, think about the purpose of life? My life is made for more than that I should disappear into the grave like that. I should still be available to my loved ones and be able to help and do them service. In this world, of course, we know the saints in heaven and all that kind of thing. But it still remains that death is an enemy. And God did not make man for death, whether he was guilty or innocent. And look at the mercy he gave Cain. He gave Cain and Mark, so that Cain would be what? That vengeance would not be taken against him as Lamech said, vengeance would be taken if someone killed him.
Yeah. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.
Correct.
So although, and we'll get in, of course, to the whole issue of self-defense, but it's tied up in that even the death of the guilty is not a desirable thing, but it's sometimes a necessary thing, and that's why there are conditions under which those that can be done. Well, this is sort of the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, the dignity of man created in the image of God, and on the other hand, death, which is to be avoided because it's not a good but an evil, and therefore these two things complement each other. But to make it secure, God then now reveals that, as we see with Moses, and even as we saw with Cain and Abel, that we ought not to kill.
Yes, the commandment, the fifth commandment, you shall not kill, of course, implies and is based on the dignity of man, and the dignity of man resides in the divine image. The divine image has traditionally been understood to reside in the human intellect and will. By the intellect, we are enabled to know God, and by the will, to love him, so that we may have communion with God. Man is the only creature on earth that was created with this end in mind, to have communion with God, and this is what gives him his dignity. It's for this reason that we are not allowed to take away human life indiscriminately. In the New Testament, this commandment was even deepened, where the Lord said, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, shall be liable to the hell of fire. This is Matthew 5:21 and 22. So it's not just a question of the negative prohibition against killing, but there's the positive injunction to love our fellow men because of their dignity, because of the image of God, because of the end for which they were created.
And that explains the tension in most of these issues, especially when you talk about justified taking of life in the context of self-defense of one kind or another. There is this tension between the dignity of the individual and the love that we owe them. For instance, in that case, the love meaning that we should be looking out for their spiritual well-being and their salvation and redemption, which could be cut short by taking their life. And on the other hand, the necessity of loving others in a society, and for when that person, there is a conflict between the love of the sinner who is a threat to the society and the love of the society who also merits protection. And we will see that tension play out. The early church, of course, we find this ambivalence in the early centuries of the church because, for instance, Christians during the pagan Roman era were not permitted to hold. They could be in government, they could be in the army, but not in positions where they had to make judgments and execute capital punishment, for instance. And so there was a clear sense of a Christian should not ever do that. And then we move into the era after Constantine when Christian teachings began to inform society, and there's an increasing sense that with the guidance of church teaching and with the guidance of an upright conscience, that you could make the decision for self-protection, protection of a society. I think today, as we're going to get into, there is sort of a revisiting as the culture of death asserts itself, how we ought to be dealing with these particular issues. Well, we're going to take a break at this point, and when we come back, we're going to deal with direct abortion and that particular instance of the life issues and why the church insists that one may never take the life of the innocent unborn.
Salve radix, salve Domina angelorum, salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces orta.
Well, we've established the principle that man has dignity that needs to be respected, and that as a consequence of that, he should not be killed. Perhaps at least today, in our own context of modern world, one of the areas where this teaching, this reality, this reasonable stance is questioned is in the case of direct abortion. That expression generally refers to the therapeutic abortion, so-called therapeutic, where there is a doctor's intervention or a chemical intervention that is used. And of course, there are also what are called natural abortions, miscarriages. But in the case of direct abortion, Father, I think today this is contested for us here and for, I think, Catholics generally and even Americans generally and people generally. It seems rather odd that you can make a distinction between human life in the womb and human life outside the womb, but people do. So they're asked, what exactly is human life that we should accord life in the womb human respect?
Yes, and even modern biology today tells us that at the moment of conception, there's a unique person there, not the father, not the mother, but a unique person with 46 chromosomes of its own. So even modern biology shows us that this personhood begins then. There's an analogy of a hunter who's going out and he's hoping to hunt and shoot a deer, and he sees something move in the bush. Now, can he shoot? No, the obligation is on him. If he's not sure it's life, he can't shoot until he's definitely proven that it's not a human being that's moving it. It's the same argument we can use for not taking the life in the womb. You have to prove first that this is not a human life before you can take it.
And it's obvious from what comes out of the womb that even if you take sort of the agnostic position that I don't know, that at some point that becomes human life. So again, you're in this position of the movement behind the bush. Do you know what is in there? And the strongest evidence is the genetic evidence, as you note, the biological evidence, the physiological evidence that everything is present at the moment of conception, understood as fertilization, the union of ovum and sperm, and not the attempt to move that to implantation. and that from that point, all that is added is growth and nutrition and development. Nothing, nothing external, nothing changes that, and what comes out is human. If you make it about the person, that's philosophy. And we could debate whether philosophically that's a person or not. You still have that question. If you don't know, you must protect it. You must. So that's the difficulty I think that many of us believers have, that why are those who favor abortion or say it should be tolerated so cavalier about this question of what is in the womb? Biologically, it's clear. It's philosophically and theologically they could argue against it. But is it in? You could make the case that in a civil society, it's not a philosophical question; it's a factual question, and the fact is answered.
The burden of proof. I'm black, and I remember when the Supreme Court wouldn't support that a black man was a man, and if they said the burden of proof is on you, as a black person to show that you're human, I'm going, what? No, there's no burden of proof on me to prove I'm a person. There's no real burden of proof on us to show that the child in the womb is a child. Look how ignorant we've become when we think the burden of proof is on life to show that it's life. That's kind of self-defeating, and for us to take pride in that we're to be pitied if we take pride in that. No, let our common sense tell us, all the slaves that came on the shores in Virginia or elsewhere, they were human. No, the burden of proof is not on them. The people in the Supreme Court who've made a decision and made our society dumb, I'm not going to listen to them because, I come from a group of people that have been victimized by a Supreme Court that said we weren't human, and the burden of proof is not on me to show I'm human.
Well, the analogy is actually more clear than that, because I think that the court and those Americans who believed in slavery accepted that African Americans, blacks, were human, but they were not a full person. They tried to denominate 3/5 or whatever it was so that they could reduce them to chattel, to property. So essentially what's being done today is denominating the humanity of the unborn to the point of some portion of personhood or graduated civil personhood, such that only at some point which the society chooses rather than reality chooses, I can give them the rights of the person.
And what the courts give, the courts can take away. Which means that in the future there's no guarantee that the courts won't decide that some obviously living, acting human beings are no longer persons because they don't fit with the profile that the court favors.
Well, you could say that's taking place in the battle for religious freedom in our day, because basically what is being said by certain governments, certain branches of government, or by cultural elites in general, is that if you are a believer, Catholic, Orthodox Jew, you could even say strict Muslim or whatever, if you're a believer, you're 8/10 of a person civilly because you dare not bring your beliefs into the public square. You may not act on them in the society. So you're human, you're an American citizen, but these rights you do not have because you are a believer. Now, if you're a pornographer or whatever, you have all the rights of free speech and all of that, but if you're a believer, you don't. Now, it's not just a matter of natural law, of course, it's a matter of teaching. The church has been quite different historically on this matter than its society. It's not like this is unusual. We've been there before where the culture held one thing and Christians held another.
Yes, you look at the early Christians in Rome. Well, their Roman neighbors lived quite differently, that the father could just reject the newborn if he didn't like the newborn. So the Christians lived quite differently, and we find that even in one of the earliest teachings of the church, the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, where it says this: "Thou shalt not procure abortion nor commit infanticide." So this has always been the constant teaching of the faith. This is always what has been believed. And then Pope John Paul II, in the Evangelium Vitae, he said that the possibility of harming, attacking, or actually denying life is completely foreign to the religious and cultural way of thinking of the people of God.
Now, sometimes the red herring is brought up that theologians, philosophers debated this personhood issue because using the biology as known at the day, they saw that something significant took place when the child could move in the womb, what was called animation. So they knew that sexual relations led to children, but they had even crazy theories up until the late middle, even the modern era in the 1700s about, what was taking place. But only in the 1800s did science really bring clarity into that, and so that we know there is this direct connection of the maternal and the paternal seed uniting together and producing this new biological individual. So the debates, the philosophical and theology debates aside, there was no debate at any point that respect was not accorded to that when the church didn't know. And that's exactly the hunter analogy we were using earlier. The church accorded that life respect even when it was unsure of the biology and philosophically what was taking place in the womb.
The time of ensoulment.
The time of ensoulment. It treated it as human life worthy of that respect and punished it if a woman had an abortion or somebody assisted in an abortion. Pope John Paul II said something else, Father. He did one of those rare things that popes do, and that is he made a declaration. It seems to me very strange that after 19 centuries, well, more than that actually, if you go back to Sinai, after 32 centuries since the promulgation of the Ten Commandments, the Pope needed to make this declaration as if people didn't understand before. But the Church sometimes does that. It ramps up the authority from the obvious to the quite obvious and says, I declare that direct abortion willed as an end or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. This doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition, and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. So we are, Father, come back to a culture of death like the early Romans had. And so that analogy, I think, is apt today, and we of course hope to save the situation.
Yes, and truth is something I call buoyant, that you can put it under the surface, but then it keeps coming up, because we're not satisfied with anything less than the truth. And that's why I think programs like this one, as well as other programs we have on EWTN, are so important. For example, there was a woman who worked in an abortion facility in Sherwood, Texas, and she happened to hear a program on Catholic radio, EWTN, where there was a woman speaking about the consequences of her own abortion, how it brought so much unhappiness in her own life. And that actually brought that woman out of that, working in that facility, as well as a co-worker. So I think the truth is something that's buoyant, and that it's for us to proclaim that truth. And then there are those that accept it, those that may hesitate to accept it, but hopefully will eventually come to embrace it.
And it also, you simply can't run from reality. The old adage, God forgives always, man forgives sometimes, nature never forgives. Nature will assert that. The guilt that women experience with respect to abortions, if they have a conscience, if their conscience is deadened by abortions, by the culture, by imbibing all of that, yes, they may get by fine after an abortion. But if they have a conscience and are listening to that, they will experience guilt. It's their nature telling them, that the life in the womb, I've taken the life in the womb of my child. And that's the buoyant truth rising to the surface naturally.
We're certainly glad for the presence of the Church in a society where a woman with a problem like that can be made to think that it's something, that a cause is different than what it is. And that she comes to the Church and the Church says, yes, this was wrong, and this is a result. Oh, what a relief to conscience when you can say to them, thank you, I've known this. And they go to confession, or they become Catholic and go to confession, and they find relief for their soul. I've heard stories of men and women who were serving in universities, and they had to do some supervised ministry thing, and they'd meet women, and they'd use the method to try to figure out what the problem was, and it traced it back to abortion, and they went to their supervisor and said, I've got this issue, and they would tell these men and women that if you touch that, you will not be in this program any longer. I will not support you. Oh, they love women? No, they don't love women. They love their jobs, they love their career, they don't love the women.
Well, and it's sort of interesting that if you take that approach to things, you end up thinking like something I read a number of years ago, in essence blaming the church, that it wasn't anybody's fault but the church that there was widespread abortion, because after all, if the church is against contraception, we shouldn't be surprised that there's more abortions. You know, the interesting thing is, abortions have gone up since contraception was introduced. And you might even, I don't know if anyone's proposed this argument, you might say, well, the fact that there is abortion is because the church won't pay to have its employees contracept. This is the kind of argumentation that you get into when you accept a lie and you can't see what common sense and the truth is raising up, that buoyant truth. David, the second of our subject areas is euthanasia. And euthanasia is from the Greek, a good death. I guess maybe looking at Socrates, I don't know if that was really a good death or not, but we certainly don't think it's a good death, do we?
No. The Holy Father, John Paul II, also in Evangelium Vitae, made the declaration regarding euthanasia. I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. This doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Depending on the circumstances, this practice involves the malice proper to suicide or murder.
And that's what we saw in the Terry Schiavo case of such fame a number of years ago, where a young woman who had been comatose for a long time, but was not dying. She had no disease that was killing her. She was simply comatose, so-called in the vegetable state. You know, this was a case where if she had been suffering from some disease and her death was imminent and that which supported her life was withdrawn so that she would die more peacefully, the Church permits that kind of withdrawal of extraordinary means. But this was a case where they withdrew her food and water, and that withdrawal was the actual act that killed her. And that's the difference between what the Church permits in terms of allowing a person with a disease to die a natural death versus killing them by a positive act of commission or the negative omission of something which they deserve. And they call it compassion.
The Catechism says in paragraph 2279, even if death is thought imminent, the ordinary care owed to a sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted. The use of painkillers to alleviate the sufferings of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity, if death is not willed as either an end or a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. So the use of painkillers, even if they may shorten a person's life, so long as the death of the person isn't the end for which the painkillers are being given, is legitimate, but not the withholding of food and water and what's necessary to the care of a patient.
I read an interesting article in the Chronicle Review, and it was written by Chris Gabbard. He was a man who followed the philosophy of Peter Singer, who is an ethicist who holds that we can have infanticide, that there are reasons that parents may decide to kill their young infant. And he was saying, yes, if that child is severely disabled or whatever the situation might be, they should have that option. But he was holding to that until his own son was born with cerebral palsy. He was a spastic quadriplegic. He said that he looked at that infant and he saw his own baby pictures. And he realized that this was a child. And here's something beautiful that he said about people's reactions, how they sometimes reacted with aversion to his son. He said many such well-meaning people would like to put an end to August's suffering, but they do not stop to consider whether he is actually suffering. At times he's uncomfortable, yes, but the only real pain here seems to be the pain of those who cannot bear the thought that people like August exist. So compassion is a word that means to suffer with, that we are willing to suffer with that person in their trial. I'd just like to conclude with his final words in this article. He said, August has allowed me an additional opportunity to profoundly love another human being. A person such as Peter Singer may well conclude reasonably that I have become overpowered by parental sentiment. So be it. I can live with that. There are limits to reason. So we are called to love.
Okay, and when we come back from this break, we're going to get into the matter of self-defense and how that relates to the individual and to the society.
Salve radix, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex quamundo luces orta.
Okay, we're back, and we've addressed abortion and euthanasia as direct assaults on human life. And there is an area where there can be an assault on life that justifies a response that can be deadly. In other words, where the protection of myself or of society results in the death of another, but somebody who is not innocent but guilty of the aggression that causes us to take their life or to do some action which takes their life. And that makes this distinction, which is very important, that it is not a violation of the fifth commandment if we take the life of a guilty person as part of a legitimate self-defense. The Catechism in number 2263 notes that the legitimate defense of persons in society is not an exception to the prohibition against the murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. The act of self-defense can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The one is intended, the other is not. So this is the principle of double effect, that in doing a good action, defending myself, and with that intention, another action, the death of the other person, comes about. But there has to be a proportion there. I can't defend my iPod by taking somebody's life. I can't defend my car by taking somebody's life. I can defend my life or a life of another if that action takes the death of another. So this is something that has to be understood in that context. I think, David, sometimes it's argued that because Christ spoke of meekness and turning the other cheek, that what the individual is free to do, say somebody in responsibility must also do. In other words, if you strike me, I can not respond to that. But what if I strike Noah? Should you say, oh, well, it's only Noah, I'm not gonna worry about it?
Well, whether it's Noah or society in general that's under threat because of unruly behavior by evildoers, there is a responsibility on the part of civil government to restore order and restrain the evildoers. St. Paul in the New Testament tells us that evildoers must be prevented from undermining the good of society. In 1 Corinthians 14:33, he says that God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, And peace, as St. Augustine defined it, is the tranquility of order. So it's the responsibility of government to restore order. And St. Paul in Romans 13:4 says, "If you do wrong, be afraid, for the governing authority does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer." So St. Paul acknowledges the right of government to restrain wrongdoers by force if necessary.
And that's an extension of the individual's right to self-defense, that if somebody attacks me, I can defend myself. Mm-hmm. I could meekly lay down before that, but as a father, and a husband, I should protect my wife and my child. As a police officer, as a government official, you don't have the right to be a pacifist. Yeah. You don't have a right not to do that, not to defend. But like the iPod in life example, there has to be a proportion there.
The Catechism has a great quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, where he said, "If a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful. Whereas if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful. Nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderate self-defense to avoid killing the other man, since one is bound to take more care of one's own life than another's." So it's that basic principle that you have moderation and proportion to the offense and what you're protecting.
So yeah, and you're not simply free to use any degree of force or any kind of action, but it must be one that has a relationship to that used against you and defends against it, no less, no more. No less from the practical point of view, because you want to stop the individual, no more from the moral point of view. You can't do more to the individual than they're prepared to inflict upon you. You must restrain them, and that might mean their death, but that needs to be your intention. This, Noah, has a particular application in capital punishment, where we move from the individual self-defense, the husband or wife defending the home against an intruder, for example, to the society defending itself against the criminal. And the church certainly posits the right of the society, of the government, of the lawful authority to do that.
So we're clear on this. Catechism point number 2267. Assuming the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. If this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor, this is in the Catechism, this is the teaching of the Church, this should be accepted because it's true. Okay? And one other thing to be made clear, when the Church says that if we can incarcerate the person rather than take their life, we should do so. But that's still within the discretion of the civil government to determine whether the incarceration will prevent the person from still inflicting harm on the common good.
And that's where most of the debate is. Those Catholics who say that capital punishment is an evil are simply wrong, because the evil would be to allow the sinner to inflict more evil than he already has on the society. The famous case of Ted Bundy, who killed 30-some women over the course of several years. Several times he was in custody, and several times he got out and continued his killing spree until he was finally caught and executed in Florida. You could make the case that here was an individual which there was a real danger that incarceration would not work. Or if Hitler had been captured rather than taking his own life, would simply have incarcerating Hitler forestalled another Nazi, of his allies and disciples. So those are judgments the civil power must make. Now, the Catechism goes on following the refinement of the teaching of John Paul II and does say, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm without definitively taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself, The cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. So that's the principle, that the proportion is what is necessary. The proportion is not what the government would like to do. So capital punishment, which observes and has observed in the deliberations this teaching, can be morally upright, but can also be morally evil if it was exceeded. You know, now you can draw an extreme example, capital punishment for a parking violation or something, you know, trivial, and that's their person clearly says, well, that's absurdly disproportionate. Yeah. So it's just a matter of degree and coming to the right decision, and the church says that that is the authority of the civil power to do, but they must observe the moral law in doing that. So I think that's the context today, the culture of death, Father, that we talked about with abortion, that in a way we're returning to, in essence, the early years of the church when she was very ambivalent about these matters because of the way they were executed, no pun intended, in the society.
Mm-hmm. So the church has always been there to forestall that movement of revenge or just seeking oneself. It's a call to love, to give, to, yes, we have to forestall violence, but using that proportionate force.
Right, and that's the judgment that the civil authority has to make. And of course, we know there have been many wrongs in that, and those wrongs need to be corrected, whether black people were disproportionately executed, not for crimes that justified it, but because they were black. There's the obvious example of not vendettas, is the word I'm...
Vigilantes?
Vigilantes, yeah, vigilantes who did that. And so obviously none of that would be justified. This moves us then into the next category, which is just war. For many, that's an oxymoron. How can you have just war? We know, as John Paul II said, capital punishment has very few occasions when it can be used. Paul VI said, war, never again. And so you think, well, then the church is opposed to all war. Can there be a just war, David?
Well, the church has traditionally listed 4 conditions for a just war. In the compendium of the Catechism, paragraph 483, it says, the use of military force is morally justified when the following conditions are simultaneously present. First, the suffering inflicted by the aggressor must be lasting, grave, and certain. Second, other peaceful means must have been shown to be ineffective. Third, there are well-founded prospects of success. And fourth, the use of arms, especially given the power of modern weapons of mass destruction, must not produce evils graver than the evil to be eliminated. So these are conditions that must be fulfilled in order for a war to be just.
Right, and we have certainly seen in the last 20 or 30 years the popes, John Paul II specifically, who was skeptical about the First Gulf War and also skeptical about the Iraq War, precisely because that they didn't seem to, in his mind, fulfill these conditions. On the other hand, other people who argued that, and even in the church, even noted Orthodox individuals, that you could, in today's environment, it was necessary sometimes to anticipate and to preempt the action of the enemy. Now, the church has never taught that, so that would be a mere theological opinion, whereas the principle of double effect and the proportionality necessary in order to execute just war, just as in just self-defense or justified capital punishment, would suggest that you need, as those 4 points illustrate, you need a cause that is actual and real and present and sufficient to justify the warlike action. So we're not here to solve the debatable wars and non-wars and police actions of history, but simply that it is not a clear issue, but the church's teaching is clear, and that's what must govern the civil authority. I think it's worth mentioning before we get into the last part of the program here that the judgment of the individual to defend himself or the society to defend itself, to be a good act, has those three conditions that every good moral act has to have. The act must be good, in this case an act of self-defense, not an act of vengeance, anger, mindless violence. The motive must be good, the intention must be good. You might say the intention must be pure. Doesn't mean it couldn't be mixed in with other things, but predominantly you have to intend that self-defense. And the circumstances. That's where the proportion comes in. Do the circumstances call for it? That first condition of the just war, or the necessity to restrain the prisoner so that he cannot inflict more harm. Is it proportionate to that necessity? So those three conditions are what must be present in all of those cases. I think finally here at the end of our discussion, we could return to what we talked about at the beginning, the hierarchy of values, that you can certainly say, as the Vatican Council did, as John Paul II did, that life issues are very broad and they encompass many things. But unless you make the distinctions and have a hierarchy of values, you're thrown into chaos as to what is the more important and what needs to be addressed first.
That not all issues have the same moral weight as abortion and euthanasia, which is a direct taking of innocent life. We can legitimately disagree or have different opinions about how to apply capital punishment or the just war. There can be discussions on that, but there's a hierarchy here where we say there's a heavier moral weight on issues like abortion and euthanasia.
Many of the people that would argue with us about abortion and euthanasia would agree with us when we say that if I didn't distinguish the hierarchy, I might end up voting for the Nazis, who did improve the economy in Germany, who did improve a number of those things. But you know what? The fundamental issue of life, they got wrong. You know? And they would agree with us on that, but they disagree with us about life important now.
Mm-hmm. And this was the point Cardinal Ratzinger made in 2004, writing to the U.S. bishops on the subject of when communion may be denied to figures who teach publicly or promote certain things publicly. He made clear that there were certain essential issues like abortion and euthanasia, but there were also other policy issues, the life issue in the broad sense. It might be the living wage, it might be health care, it might be unions, it might be capital punishment, and the protections there, that because these issues are not at the core of the gospel of life. They're part of the gospel of life, but they're not at the core, and unless you establish the core, the rest of it is for naught.
Yeah, those secondary matters, although important, make no sense except on the presumption that the first matter is being seen to and being protected, namely the life of the individual.
Well, I hope that we have brought some enlightenment to this question of the life issues, all of which are important, but not all of which are equally important. Just as all truths in the teachings of the Church are important, but yet the Church does acknowledge and teach that the doctrine of the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Redemption are central. Everything else flows from that. And likewise, we must be integral Catholics in our consciences, in our voting, and all of our actions in the public square if we are to manifest our Christian belief to the world.
Salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces volta, cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, vale o vale decora, et pro nobis Christum exora.
Dignare me laudare te, Virgo sacrata.
Da mihi virtutem contra hostes tuos,